Hi, and welcome to our course on value creating conversations and our first module. And it's really around so why bother to plan your conversations? Well, let's start by identifying the four potential outcomes that are the possibilities from a customer conversation. The first one is disqualification. We choose, as a result of the conversation, to disqualify the opportunity on the basis of what we've learned. Second option, a halt. The prospect declines to continue the conversation. Third potential outcome, a continuation in which we both agree to continue talking, but without any real meaningful commitment. And then the fourth potential outcome from a meaningful customer conversation is an advance in which both we and the customer commit to a tangible next step. Now, the sooner we disqualify a bad opportunity, the better. And I hope you'll agree that advances are far more valuable than continuations. But if we look at where ineffective salespeople tend to spend most of their time and the outcomes they tend to generate from their customer conversations, they tend to result in an awful lot of halts or continuations. On the other hand, when we look at the record and the performance of top performing salespeople, they're far more likely to either disqualify the opportunity or to agree in advance with the prospect. Now, let's look at conversations from the customer's perspective and how they think about their typical conversations with typical salespeople. And it's not a particularly pleasant picture because prospective customers report that fewer than 1 in 5 of their conversations with salespeople end up being a valuable use of their time, that the vast majority are wastefully unproductive. And they are particularly unhappy, they tell us, at having to listen to crude, poorly researched product pitches or being subjected to a stream of what they see as being irrelevant qualifying questions that only benefit the salesperson. So it's no wonder, is it, that it's become increasingly hard to persuade new prospects to even agree to speak to a salesperson until and unless they feel they absolutely have to. We have to do something about this. But then let's look at it from the salesperson's perspective. And it isn't much better when you look at it from the salesperson's shoes. For the average salesperson, only a minority of even apparently successful conversations with prospective customers result in them agreeing to a meaningful advance. The rest are, at best, continuations. And it's really important here not to confuse activity with outcomes. Having a high volume of conversations that fail to generate many meaningful advances ends up being nothing more than busy foolishness. And it's a waste of time and effort for everybody concerned. So I want you to consider this, and it's that the number of meaningful advances achieved is a far more accurate predictor of your future sales success than the number of calls or conversations that you've attempted or completed. And you should resist being measured on primarily activity based measures and look instead to be measured on outcome related metrics. So, if you think about that background, it ought to be obvious that every customer communication conversation needs to create genuine mutual value. And that needs to happen because those conversations address the questions that turn out to be important to each of the parties. So, if we start thinking about the conversation from the salesperson's perspective, you're probably going to be asking, is this a qualified opportunity? Are we talking to the right people? Do we have a good solution fit? Are they likely to buy anything or to buy anything from us? Will the effort be worth it? And what should our next step be and when? So these are sort of questions you need to be asking about the nature of the conversation you're having. But also remember the potential customers probably asking a whole series of questions of themselves. And they're asking themselves, is this project actually worth pursuing? Are we aligned around what we need and how to choose? Can we trust this vendor? Does their potential solution address our needs? And what should our next step be and when? So you can see both the salesperson and the customer are asking themselves parallel but different questions. And by the way, that's one reason why we need to always seek to establish what I'll call a give get balance. And that every participant needs to emerge from every conversation believing it was a good use of their time. So if we think about something for everyone, everybody needs to emerge feeling they've learned something useful. And yes, that it was a good use of their time. Every member of the audience, every participant has an opportunity to contribute to that conversation. And this is made so much easier if we've taken the time to ask everyone what they want to get out of the conversation right at the start. And then if you think about other consequences of a give get balance, it needs to be a genuine conversation and not a broadcast. No single participant should be allowed to dominate the conversation. There should be no long, unbroken monologues. And presentations and demonstrations must be punctuated by questions and feedback. These are some of the building blocks of achieving that give get balance. And I want to introduce an idea to you that I'll be coming back to pretty regularly. And it's a quote from Neil Rackham, who did some outstanding research over decades into what makes for effective selling. And he concluded that good selling depends on good planning more than any other single factor. In other words, if as salespeople we fail to plan, we are planning to fail. So I want to introduce a recipe for success. I'll call it the conversational layer cake. And high impact customer conversations tend to have a very clear and effective before, during, and after structure. And that's what we'll be looking at through the rest of this particular course. So before the conversation, we need to make sure we've prepared the ground. During the conversation, there are really three key layers. The first one is setting the scene up front. Once we've done that, we can move into the core of the conversation. But of course, we've also got to allow ourselves time to agree the conclusions. And then after the conversation, well, yes, we need to analyze the outcomes to see whether our plans work, to see what we learned. So this is the conversational layer cake. This is the value creating conversational framework. Now, if we think about this as a layer cake, before the conversation, the first layer involves doing our research, establishing smart objectives, and making sure we've got the logistics right. And then as we move into the live conversation, the second layer, setting the scene, is really about the all important first few minutes of the customer conversation. And that includes pre agreeing a provisional next step. And we'll look at this in much more detail in subsequent modules in this course. And then the third layer involves the core of the conversation. And in summary, we need to be thinking about four key elements of that core of the conversation. What do we plan to teach the customer? What do we want to learn? What do we intend to share with the customer? And what can we anticipate them asking us? And then as we wrap up, of course, the final layer of the conversation itself involves agreeing the conclusions and establishing or reconfirming the next steps with the customer. And then after the conversation, of course, yes, we've got to reflect on what happened, on the outcomes, on the results. We've got to follow up on the agreed actions And yes, of course, we've got to learn from the experience. And these are the elements we'll be introducing layer by layer in the next few modules in this course. Now, before we conclude, though, this introductory module, I want to introduce to you the Conversation Planning Workbook. It's a one-page workbook. It's designed to help you and your colleagues to systematically and successfully prepare and manage and analyze all of your significant customer conversations. It's an editable workbook and it spans all 5 layers that I've just introduced to you. And it encourages and stimulates you to think through all the key things you need to know and do before, during, and after each conversation. And it's particularly valuable when your conversation includes one or more of your colleagues, and when you want to ensure that every one of your colleagues is on the same page. So please pause for a moment and download it from the resources available on this course. And it might be useful to have a printed copy in front of you as we go through the remaining modules. So, as usual, at the end of every module, I'm going to ask you, how has this module perhaps helped you to think differently? How has it helped you to change the way you think about the importance of preparing for and planning your conversations in response to some of these ideas? And yes, even more important, what are you now going to do differently? What are you determined that maybe you need to be starting to do? What do you now realize maybe it was an unproductive habit or what have you, or something you didn't do, you need to stop doing? And how are you going to make what you were already doing even more effective as a result? And even at this early stage of the course, I think it might be worthwhile if you write those thoughts down and start to make some commitments to yourself so that you can revisit them, you can apply them, and you can evaluate your success in putting those principles into practice. And of course, to learn and maybe update and amend your conclusions. So please do that. So there we go. We've laid the foundation for the value creating conversation framework. I hope you found these introductory ideas useful and you'll want to put them into practice in your day-to-day conversations with your prospective customers. And I wish you the very best of success in doing that. But in our next module, we're going to turn our attention to some of the detailed thinking behind making sure that we prepared the ground to have a successful conversation. And I hope you'll want to join me online for that module in the very near future.